we're here today with Dr. Al Frankowski and Dr. Grant Silva. Dr. Frankowski, you are a professor where?
At Northeastern Illinois University.
Okay.
In Chicago.
And what department?
I'm in the philosophy department, and I also teach classes that are in the African and African American Studies department.
I see. Dr. Silva?
I'm in the philosophy department at Marquette University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
Okay. And both of you have come here to Savannah State to participate in lectures sponsored by the QEP Institute, and we're going to be talking about race and politics a little later today. My name, by the way, is Professor Walter Isaac. I'm a lecturer here at Savannah State, Lecturer of Humanities, and I have some questions for you. I think people would want to know more about the kind of work that you do and what kinds of talents and ideas you bring here to Savannah State.
Yes.
Yeah. So feel free to chime in if I'm asking each of you a question. But I'll start with Al. And Al, can you just share with our hearers and our viewers a little bit about your background? You know, where do you come from? Mm-hmm. Let's start there.
Okay. I grew up in California, in San Jose, California. For most of my life, that's where I was, and I come from a middle class, middle working class family, I was a first generation student.
First generation student? You mean in college?
In college, yeah.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
My father who was a baker. He recently retired. Had a high school. He had a high school education. My mother finished high school and took one or two classes in college, but neither of them went on in college. They met. They have ties to Georgia in the sense that they met in Sylvania, Georgia, and my dad was in the Navy at one point, and then he left and came back. And when he came back, he remembered my mom, and they picked up from there and eventually moved out to California. I did my graduate work in Oregon, and then now I live in Chicago, I think that part of the question too, maybe some people would be interested in knowing a little bit about my dad is Italian, and my dad is Italian and Polish, so the last name Frankowski comes from from the Polish side of the family, and my mom is African American, and so often there's a sort of racial ambiguity that I tend to get amused with.
Tell us a little bit. Do you have like a particular story that kind of illustrates that? That stands out more.
That stands.
Yeah.
I mean, there are a number of times when, I think that one of my earliest memories of sort of thinking about being racially ambiguous come from high school. I went to high school it's just south of San Jose and Morgan Hill. Morgan Hill is a much smaller town than San Jose, it was the high school I went to was predominantly white, and so oftentimes the fact that it's racially ambiguous, white students often didn't know exactly what my ethnicity was, so they didn't know exactly how to react to me, and African American students often would pick up on that I was mixed race. But even there was a lot of confusion as to where I saw myself. And so I think for racialized students, and I still see this, for racialized students, racialized faculty, there's a question in terms of, well, where do I see myself? And for non-racialized folks, though, it's a bit entertaining to see, especially since I've learned a bit more not to ease that anxiety right away. They'll look at the last name, they'll say Frankowski, and they go, that's Polish. I'm not sure about this.
You can see the wheels.
I can see the wheels. I can see the wheels. They want to know, but you know, I try to hold off as much as possible. Maybe for our format, that's not as.
That's great. So Dr. Silva, same question. Like, can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Yeah, so I was born at UCLA Medical Center in Los Angeles. I was, for the most part, raised throughout the east side of Los Angeles. And so at first I lived in Boyle Heights, which is just right outside downtown LA on the east side. And I lived all throughout what's commonly referred to as East LA, East Los Angeles. And to this day, my mom and my brothers and my family, my stepfather now live far east Los Angeles in a city called Whittier, California. The side of Los Angeles that I'm from is predominantly Latina, predominantly Mexican American, although it's increasingly becoming more mixed Hispanic, mixed Latin American. There are people from El Salvador. There's an assortment of Latin Americans living in the side of Los Angeles that I'm from. I too like to withhold certain things about individuals yearning for the kind of information that you were describing, Elle, in the sense that oftentimes people will ask me about, you know, my ethnicity or my race. They'll want to try to figure out where I'm from, and I'll tell them that I'm from California, which doesn't resolve the issue. And then they'll say, well, where's your family from? And I'll say, oh, well, my grandmother was born in Oklahoma. And that still doesn't resolve the issue.
That probably makes it worse, right?
Yeah. For a minute they think, oh, so he's Native American? Is that it? And then I tell them that my maternal great-grandparents were braceros. They were field workers. They came to the United States when the United States needed Mexico's help, when the United States needed immigrants to come and work the fields and come and do an assortment of jobs that Americans, quote-unquote Americans, didn't want to do. And so, you know, on my mother's side, I'm a third generation Mexican American. But I still have a sense of, I still feel alienated in many ways from the predominant national identity of the United States, if there is such a thing. But from my father's side, my father's is a plastic surgeon in Mexico, in Guadalajara, the second largest city in Mexico. And my parents split up when I was about between 2 and 3, so I wasn't raised by him. And so I really think that experience set off a profound identity crisis, concerned with who I am, you know, what does it mean to be a person of Mexican descent in the United States, right? Why a person like myself from East LA wouldn't be the first thing you think about when you think of an American. I remember being very young and having that kind of insight, and that kind of crisis to some extent, right? And it set off a profound concern with questions of identity, which easily blossomed into philosophy. But I would definitely say that where I'm from and how I grew up impact my life and work, my research, in ways that I can't ignore and that I like to underscore often.
Would you describe yourself as a, shall we say, a Latino or a Latin American philosopher, or
I would I guess I would describe myself as a Latino philosopher, which in many ways is to make a political statement, right? In the context of professional academic philosophy.
Okay.
Like to say that I am a Latino philosopher, that my status as Mexican or Mexican American or Latinx, or everyone wants to describe it, is significant to the philosophical process. It's in many ways something that I'm interested in. It's something that I think about often. You know, to what extent does my racial ethnic difference impact the philosophical process? Because not everyone's on board with that. A lot of people would think, you know, the purpose of philosophy is to abstract away from that kind of particularity. But I'm one who thinks that my identity and human identity, especially our social identity, matters philosophically. And in that sense, there's a approach to philosophy that not shared by all mainstream philosophers, but I think it's one that has a lot of significance for people who want to think philosophically from diverse perspectives. And so, yeah, I would very much identify in that way.
Now both of you are doing work along these lines that has to do with race and impact on race and philosophical work. And I know Al, you have published a book with respect to this topic, but can you share with our viewers a little bit more about your work? Because you do some work in aesthetics, right?
Yeah. So my book, The Postracial Limits of Memorialization.
Go buy it.
Or order for your library.
Yes.
And then when the soft cover comes out, then buy it.
Oh, geez, yeah. Good point.
My book, it is sort of a multi-pronged book that addresses or takes up questions of our racial identity in our current context. But it's also taking up these questions aesthetically. And so, the work tries to manage two things: political discourse on racism and aesthetics on the other hand. And by aesthetics here, I mean questions concerning how race or racism shows up, how it doesn't show up, the conditions by which racism shows up, the conditions by which it does not show up, and also how our own ability to understand what's showing up and not showing up, how we go about it. And so the postracial limits of memorialization aesthetically argues for a way of thinking about the postracial not as a determinate state of affairs, but as a discursive strategy that allows for certain arrangements, certain relationships to race and racism, either to show up or to not show up. And so, oftentimes the way to sort of think about political oppression is to think about if the voices of the oppressed are not showing up, then what we need to do is to get them to show up. We need to recognize them in some sense. And so any effort to recognize them ends up being an effort to eliminate that oppression. However, interestingly enough, we are in an anti-black context, right? So the questions that I'm asking is, what happens when memory acts of memory or acts of memorialization are happening in a context of anti-blackness? On the one hand, in many places across the United States, Savannah is not an exception to this, right? But many places across the United States have a very rich tradition of ignoring black memory, ignoring memory to the richness of the anti-black experience of blacks in this country. But as time goes on, right, we start to see memorials show up, often geared around particular themes: slavery, Jim Crow, the most extreme forms of Jim Crow, the most explicit acts of violence, and the civil rights. And then we're done, right? That sort of heavy-handedness of the distribution of various images conveniently maps onto a discourse of progress, and conveniently allows us to remember in the present and not remember at the same time. And that's what the work is neurotically obsessed over. How do we have memory appearing and not appearing at the same time? How do we have an act of remembrance looking like a step of something, looking like an act of progress. And yet we ought to worry quite a bit as to whether or not that's not a type of regression. And I think one of the moves in that work is to try to take seriously how a politics of recognition, on the one hand, addresses oppression, but in a post-racial moment, the recognition itself might work against the political aims. It might displace or decontextualize more. So today's talk will be a little bit, we'll play around a little bit with thinking about the Martin Luther King Memorial in Washington, D.C. along those lines. And it's something I would call the first post-racial memorial, but we can't think that memorial without also thinking about the death of Trayvon Martin, which happened in the same summer.
Mm-hmm.
Post-racial discourse, I think, embodies these sorts of contradictions, where the aesthetic is doing something very different than the political discourse. And so that's what the book is very interested in. I think that one of the maybe more controversial statements of the book, claims of the book, is that we ought to be concerned not here with what we remember. Acts of memory are definitely important, and what we remember is definitely important. But I think what post-racial, as these various aesthetic acts of memorialization happen, we ought to be very concerned about what the role of our agency is in all of this. How is it that we can have something that produces memory, and yet it strips us of our political agency, or it reinforces the ways in which we are more separate? How is it that we have various acts that look like they are a joining together of groups against a state of oppression, and yet that might make us more, or underscore the ways in which we are complicit with that oppression? And so the last few chapters of the book pull away from thinking about aesthetics only in terms of representation and recognition and identity, and think more in terms of the felt sense of collectivity. And I rewrite a way of thinking about mourning within that context.
Now, along those lines, thinking about mourning and collectivity, I would ask you, like, how do you see the next generation, or should I say the next century of racism evolving or even evaporating along the lines that Dr. Frankowski is describing? Like, how do you see the nature of racism?
No, I think L's work is really important, and his use of the term post-racial is important for reasons that it signifies the need to think about novel instantiations of race, racism, and racialized identity. David Theo Goldberg has this point in his book, Are We Yet Post-Racial?, where he says, post-racial doesn't signify the end of racism or race per se, but it signifies the end of a particular way of thinking about race relations, and racism. So it's the end of a particular moment in the history of race and in racism. And I think that's really important to keep in mind, because racism has always been dynamic. It's always been the kind of thing that right when you think you got your finger on it, it shifts, transforms, it turns into something new. It turns into some area where we didn't see race or racism operating, and now all of a sudden it is. And so in some of my own research, I've attempted to think about racism as a kind of self-love. I don't think that in this day and age we can limit racism to ways of thinking, ways of denigrating black or Latino or minority identity in ways that's predicated on hatred. Like, a lot of hatred exists, and a lot of black people and brown people in the United States, and by brown I mean Latinos, Latinas, but then, you know, also people of Muslim faith, people who are of Arabic background, right, brown people in general. The kind of hatred that they face is very real. But there's a way in which racism today isn't just about hatred. There are tropes of self-preservation that really take place in the context of rather racialized social situations. And so here I'm thinking about the phenomenon of police officer related shootings of African Americans, right? Where in the United States, prior to their shift or watch, a lot of law enforcement agents will say the following to themselves: whatever happens today, I'm coming home. Right? Whatever happens today, I'm coming home. And, you know, this isn't, what that statement says is police officers are not robots, right? They have families, they have life goals, plans that they want to get home to. You know, the persons. And when they're put in situations where that individual may or may not have a gun, they're not going to take the risk. I'm coming home today. I'm getting home to my daughter, right? And right there, self-preservation can lead to a rather racist scenario. Now, if we're thinking about racism strictly on the basis of hatred, we lose the ability to identify these novel instantiations of racism that are taking place. Not to reduce the black experience in the United States, but you see tropes of self-preservation taking place in a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment, particularly that aimed at refugees and asylum seekers, but, you know, also at people of various Latin American identities, Latinx identities, Hispanics in the United States, right? For a lot of US nationals, right, for a lot of nativists, with an influx of migrants in this nation, with an influx of immigrants, right, comes change that in many ways threatens the sense of self that a lot of people hold near and dear. In the sense that with all of these Spanish speakers in town, I gotta start learning Spanish. I can't just go to the supermarket anymore. There's all these signs in Korean, right? I see people praying to a God that's very unfamiliar to me. And in many ways, the dynamic social atmosphere that we see unfolding before us destabilizes the identity formation that a lot of, you know, white people in the United States really hold close to the heart. So as this nation is becoming more and more immigrant, more and more brown, as this nation is diversifying, the social conditions that have often provided for, say, white identity in the United States are being destabilized. And people want to keep the sense of self that their society makes possible, and that's self-preservation.
But I have a question for both of you, and you see it coming, right? So if this is a matter of at least in part self-love, self-preservation, right? To what extent is it endemic to the human condition? Because what I hear you saying is that you're kind of caught in a catch-22, right? We can't get rid of memory. Mm-hmm. Right, like it's not something that we can completely expunge. Right?
No.
And it sounds like what you're saying is there's something there might be something about self-love, which is, you know, kind of self-aggrandizement. But it also sounds like you're saying that like fight or flight is a manifestation of self-love on some level.
Sure.
It sounds like you're saying both. So my question to you all is, do you see our propensity to racism as endemic to the human condition?
I don't necessarily think of it as endemic to the human condition so much as something that has sort of grown out of our capitalistic structure. And so I look at it look at it, I'm trying to, my work is focused on the structural element of it. And so as much as possible, I try to resist any notion of thinking about it in terms of people's psychology or what they're, are making claims about it in terms of human nature. I take a fairly straightforward structuralist way of thinking about that. We're caught in a situation, and that situation, or we're caught in a context, and that context structurally is one that has a history of racism.
No, what is
and so I don't think that there's any way to go. I don't think there's any way to go underneath that, right? We can't really start our thinking underneath or without racism, because that's one of the forms of violence that has formed us.
Now, what is the relationship between that situatedness and what you were saying before about like the relationship between the agency and complicity and those things? Like what is the role of the agency of the person in that context?
Yeah. So I think that in our context, right? So if we think in terms of the way in which we're situated, I'll use continental philosophy language, right? Okay. Always already in a context, right? And that context is one that is formed out of a violence of racism, of a racist past. And then we always have to take into consideration what that situatedness means as we align ourselves with particular causes, as we think that we are forming these various actions, right? The Women's March, largely liberatory, but mainly white women. And so what is going on in the way in which white femininity, white feminism is sort of is making a claim here? And is it leaving behind its inclusiveness? Is it regressing, for example, right? If it, in terms of how women of color are either opting out or felt marginalized.
You're saying that's a form of complicity.
I think that it becomes very confusing at that point, right? I think it becomes very complex. On the one hand, we have something that is liberatory, and on the other hand, we have something that may also look like a form of complicity. Yeah. I think there are different reads of that particular phenomena, but I think that the question of agency and the question of complicity becomes extraordinarily complex at that level.
Okay, and what would you say about the relationship between humanity and how you're describing racism?
I think it's very natural to fear, feel fear, right? I think it's very natural to seek out self-preservation whenever possible. And I think to some extent the human mind, the human brain is endowed with the capacity to typify, to stereotype, right? I think there's no doubt part of our bioevolutionary history is the ability to differentiate the good berries from the bad berries. Last time Pablo ate those berries, he didn't come home right, So I think typification, stereotyping is part and parcel of human cognition. The thing that happens with racial stereotypes and racism is that it affixes itself to this very human phenomena of stereotyping. We learn race in our society, in the social structures, as Alfred was saying, that we inhabit. We learn how to wield race, how to use race, racism, the knowledge that comes with racialized identities in ways that can prove beneficial to some, and it serves as a detriment for others, right? And so I think by all means that there's a sense in which the human mind cannot help but stereotype. But when people run with that, it becomes somewhat of a cop-out, because then my racism is just innate. It's just a part of my brain, right? It's just part of how I see the world. I can't help it. And right there's a removal of agency in a certain sense. Someone's exculpated for being a racist. Why? Well, because I failed this implicit bias test, and they keep saying I have a strong preference for white people. You know what I mean? And I really don't think of myself as having a strong preference for white people, but this is the score I keep getting when I take this test. And so, one of the things that I'm interested in thinking about is the way in which, to go back to the examples that I was using in, police officer related shootings of African Americans or anti-immigrant sentiment, is that feeling of fear, the feeling of the need for self-preservation that is really at the heart of these, post-racial instantiations of racism. It's a product of the social structures that we inhabit. You're taught to fear certain people as opposed to others.
Right.
You're taught to trust people. You're taught to recognize some individuals as a knowledge proprietor, right? You're taught to view other peoples as objects that you need to be on guard against. And so the sense of fear and self-preservation that really motivates the self-love that I'm concerned with is a product of society. And here I have to give a shout out to my man Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who, the idea of amour propre, self-love, what Rousseau says in the discourse on inequality is self-love is the desire to be recognized with a certain kind of esteem. It's the desire to be recognized as a particular kind of individual that is a product of social relations, existing social relations. And so there's a very natural sense of self-preservation, Rousseau says, right? Amour de soi, sort of just regular self-love, or self-preservation, you can say. But it's corrupted, it's commandeered by the workings of our society. And that's just grounded in human artifice, right? That's a product of our efforts, collective efforts. And so right there, I want to still hold us accountable for how amidst our situatedness, we're still taking the reins. We're not doing much to change those social structures that we've inherited. We just continue with them.
I think I would add a little bit to that, because I think that was wonderfully sort of set out. Like, okay, so we're learning all of this stuff sort of as we learn other social behaviors, right?
Yeah.
And so I would say it's not only that we're learning racism, we're learning a comfort level with that. Like, as we learn to be comfortable, as we learn kind of our place in the world, we're also learning sort of these various racialized narratives, these racialized relations to space, and these racialized relationships to safety and security, and at a very bodily level. And so I think part of like why I focused in on the aesthetic so much is because it's in the aesthetic that we get a sort of challenge to, or at least a critical interrogation of our very sensibility, right? And so thinking about this on the one hand structurally, on the other hand in terms of thinking about sort of what's behind all of this, I think brings us to a very similar.
Can I say
point.
something here?
Go ahead, real quick.
Because I think this is right on. Thinking about comfort and discomfort is really crucial here, because, and perhaps this makes me some kind of humanitarian or something, right? I have a positive outlook on human beings, but I don't think that racism was ever done for the sake of racism. Maybe that's a premise that not everyone can accept, but I don't think someone just woke up and said, today I'm just gonna hate Latino people, right? I think racism, it's always had this goal, this end, of either extracting the labor, the land, the resources of those persons subject to racialized identities and racialized policies, right? So you want something from them, so racism helps justify taking it. Or racism, the goal of racism today is to maintain an elevated social status, to maintain an elevated sense of self, certain expectations about what you're entitled to, what you're not entitled to, that come at the expense of others who really play the foil for those kinds of privilege, right? That a lot of people think is just natural, right? It's just normal. I'm entitled to this kind of existence, when in reality, that's an elevated status that's predicated on racism. And so it really one of the things that I try to do in my work is think about how people really don't want to talk about racism as extracting the labor or the land, say, of individuals anymore, although that does happen. But really, racism is meant to keep those comfort levels that have been put in place by our, historical situations.
Now, both of you, I have a question for both of you, and it kind of branches off from how you've been describing how racism becomes transmitted, through society, particularly as it's taught, right?
Mm-hmm.
As you know, Savannah State's a teaching institution, right? And both of you have really experienced the teaching in various diverse student bodies. So my first question for each of you would be, how does teaching this kind of sensibility towards racism come out in your writing? Like, what is your writing process? Like, what goes into you writing about these ideas that you've shared with us?
Mm-hmm.
And the second question is a matter of pedagogy. How do you teach these ideas to students who themselves may have been socialized into having a certain comfort level with racist ways of knowing, racist ways of thinking, and so on?
Yeah, I'll jump on that first. I mean, I'll say some things later on in the presentation today about writing philosophy from a racialized perspective, because it's difficult. A lot of philosophy is predicated on achieving a certain level of discursive breadth, right?
Mm-hmm.
A universality that spans space and time. You want to be on the same level as Plato, as Descartes, as Kant, right? You want to speak to them.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times you have to distance your writing from yourself, from the particularities of who you are, in order to, realize a philosophical voice. You got to say something that makes sense to all people in some way. And when I write, I'm very intentional about not maintaining that kind of voice, right? And not that my work can't translate to others, I think it can, but there's a way in which one can approach writing philosophy in a way that really uses your sense of self, the particularities of who you are, as an advantage, as a benefit, right? So, and I could give you an example of this in the context of my pedagogy, right? So I teach at Marquette, which is in Milwaukee, which is in Wisconsin, and we're a private Jesuit school, right? Predominantly Caucasian students, white students from the suburbs of Chicago or the suburbs of Milwaukee, and some rural areas. And we do get students from international students, and we do get students from across the United States. So I'm not forgetting about them. But a majority of my students are inhabiting positions of white privilege, right? And one of the things I have to do, one of the obstacles I face in talking about and teaching about racism, is getting them to trust me, getting them to recognize that I'm not here to make them feel guilty. I'm not here to make them feel responsible for, slavery in the United States. But I am here to have them think about the ways in which they maintain positions of privilege by either evading questions connected to history and memory, or by thinking about them in rather stereotypic manners, right? So, you talk about race during, Black History Month, and it's the Civil Rights Movement, and it's Dr. King's work, right? And so one of the things I try to do is I teach racism through my experience and participation in sexism. I teach racism through my participation in patriarchy. Because I don't like to think of myself as someone who explicitly oppresses women, right? I don't like to think of myself as someone who hates women, right? But I do have to recognize that a lot of the privileges that I've inherited are in some ways connected to the patriarchal outlook of our society. And so I try to teach and get students to think about their privilege through being very honest about the forms of privilege that I inhabit, right? And so my participation in patriarchy as a silent partner in patriarchy, right, a reluctant but nonetheless, partner in patriarchy is one way I do it. I also get them to think about their first world privilege, right? I also try to get them to think about how, as United Statesians, they think of themselves as entitled to certain things that when in reality, a majority of the world views as a luxury clean water, right? I mean, think of the water crisis in Flint. Clean water, people think, how can that happen in the United States? You know, that's how a majority of the world lives. And so I really try to think about my participation in oppressive structures as a way to get my students to put their guard down. So I don't look like the self-righteous, you know, Latino, non-white, who is, you know, there just to make them feel bad. I do want them to be uncomfortable. I do want them to think critically. I want them to entertain questions that they don't want to think about. Because it's all too easy to stop thinking about racism in this society. It's all too easy to stop thinking about sexism, right? Especially if you're in a position of privilege. And so I try to make them uncomfortable, but in ways that will promote growth, hopefully.
Right.
So
Writing?
Writing,
Process and pedagogy.
Yeah, I think that for me, writing is always moving from a position of comfort into a position of uncomfort. And so I kind of write my way through. Where I'm most comfortable at, I'm most comfortable with thinkers that I've studied a lot of their work, if not all of their work.
Mm-hmm.
And so I often will start with, this is a more recent phenomenon. I'll start with figures that I'm very comfortable with, and then I'll start to cross them out of the text. And then as I write through them, I find the ideas that I'm really excited about, and ideas that I'm very comfortable with, and then I write through those, and I start to cross those ideas out, and or I start to find ways of thinking about them from an opposite angle. So we were just talking about the women's march. This is something that I thought I was just so happy to see. I mean, this is a wonderful counterpoint, I thought, in this political moment. But does it make me too comfortable? Yeah, it starts to make me too comfortable, and then I start to get very nervous that I'm too comfortable with this. And so, so I always move from comfort to uncomfort in my writing. And then once I've arrived at a point where I say, I'm not quite sure. This seems to be challenging both as a sort of an opponent that I am comfortable challenging, but this also seems to be challenging my starting point. Then I think I'm just about where I want to be at. And so that typically is the writing process, and I tend to move from very detailed scholarship to much more of my own ideas. It's very hard for me to put my own ideas first. And so that's typically the process. I also, in terms of working, I tend to work on a book scale before I work on an essay scale. So I tend to have lots of pieces that are sort of percolating, and ideas that are sort of interconnected before they start to distill themselves into essays. So I'm much better at the book level than I am at the essay level. And so I'm just sort of backwards in that way. I think there would be a lot. It would do me better to be an essay writer, but at this point, I think this comes out of my art, out of a sort of background in art, right? Where you work with the canvas, right? And it doesn't matter how big or small the canvas is, but you work with the whole canvas first, and then the picture starts to come into its own as you fill in the details. And I think in terms of writing, that's always kind of been where I've gone with that. And I think in terms of the classroom, I work with the whole classroom, right? And so it's the same sort of thing. We work on problems together. I never know what's going to happen in that classroom. I never know exactly how we're going to go about getting at these philosophical questions. One of the things I had to learn was that at NEIU we have a vast range of students who we have questions as to why they're not at Yale or Harvard, and some who are coming back to college after long delays, or some who are just entering college for the very first time in their largest population of our students, first generation.
Wow.
And our average student is a 26-year-old female with two children.
Oh, wow.
And so they have a vast array of experiences, and so the first thing to do in the classroom, is to remind myself what philosophy is all about, and it's not about its history. It's not about particular arguments. I think that we build the skill to read argumentatively, but that's a skill that doesn't have to be built solely in one class. I think that the main thing for us to do in a philosophy class, the main thing that I'm trying to do with them is to get them to think creatively and to see that their voice matters. And if I can do those two things, if I can get them to see that their voice matters and that writing is their main tool for that. And if I can get them to see that it's really fun to play with ideas, then it's a success. And by the time we get to something like thinking about race, I hope that they see that those dangerous thoughts are the most important ones. Those ones where they're challenging what they formerly believed, and they're challenging the position that they're comfortable being an opponent to. And so that it's not that problem of like, oh, I feel so awful. I think my classes are downers. I think they start as downers, and I think they get worse as we go on. But the point isn't just to feel bad about the world. It's to see the world more complexly, to see that we don't fit in this world very, very well, and that all we have to do is start asking a few questions that sort of break those various narratives, and then the world does look very complex to us, and we might feel bad about it, but that's not the most important thing. The most important thing is to keep pursuing those questions. And many of those questions are things that my students are the only ones who can ask, because they don't come from these sort of various entrenched power structures. So when I started my critical race theory class, I said this. I said, I look around this room and I see that you don't look like the typical philosophy class. You don't look like the typical class for which these institutions were built. And you're not. But we will take these institutions, we will take this institution, and we will make this our own, right? And that's part of teaching, I think, teaching philosophy of race, or teaching Africana philosophy, teaching Latin American philosophy, is that these walls, we should never fool ourselves. These walls weren't meant to educate in this way.
I'll tell you, we have to bring it to a close right there, but both of you are extraordinary thinkers, and we welcome your participation in the intellectual life of Savannah State, and I'm sure our viewers will gain a lot from all the wisdom you've shed on us over the last hour or so. So with that, we're going to bring it to a close. Thank you very much, Dr. Grant Silva, Dr. Al Frankowski.
Thank you for inviting us.
Yeah, thank you, Walter.
You're very welcome. Very welcome.